Long before the East India Company existed, the world moved at a gentler pace. There were no engines, no loud machines, no glowing screens, only wind, water, and time. In the late 16th century, England was a quiet island nation. Most people lived close to the land. Fields stretched across the countryside. Church bells marked the passing hours. At night, darkness truly meant darkness. Candles flickered softly, and silence settled like a blanket over villages and towns. Far beyond England, across vast oceans and unknown waters, lay lands filled with spices, silks, cotton, and stories. India was one such land, ancient, diverse, and deeply rooted in tradition. For centuries, trade between East and West had moved slowly. Caravans crossed deserts, ships hugged coastlines. Goods passed through many hands before reaching Europe. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were rare and precious. They were not everyday items, they were treasures. A small pouch of spice could be worth a fortune. European kingdoms watched these trade routes with quiet interest. Portugal and Spain had already sent ships far across the seas. Their sailors followed the winds, guided by stars and simple maps. England, watching patiently, began to dream of its own path. The English merchants of London were not explorers by nature. They were careful people. They counted coins. They kept records. They believed in planning. In quiet rooms filled with wooden tables and parchment papers, they talked about opportunity. They spoke softly about distant markets, about ships that could sail farther, about profits that could change lives. Outside, the River Thames flowed steadily, carrying small boats and quiet reflections of the sky. The merchants understood something important. Trade was power, but patience was stronger. Across the ocean, India followed its own rhythm. Villages woke to the sound of birds. Markets opened slowly. Rivers like the Ganges and Yamuna flowed as they always had. Empires rose and rested. The Mughal Empire ruled vast lands with structured administration, rich culture, and long-established trade systems. Indian merchants were experienced. They knew the value of their goods. They had traded with Arabs, Persians, and Asians for generations. Life there did not hurry for Europe. Monsoons arrived on time. Crops followed seasons. History moved in long, steady breaths. Back in England, the sea called quietly. Shipbuilders worked along the coast. They shaped timber slowly, carefully. Every plank mattered. Every rope had purpose. Sailing was dangerous. Storms were unpredictable. Many ships never returned. But risk and reward often walked together. By the end of the 1500s, England stood at a turning point. The old ways were still present, but the future waited beyond the horizon. Merchants gathered more often now. They shared ideas. They imagined a company, not owned by one man, but by many investors together. This was a new idea, a shared journey, a shared risk. On cold evenings, as candles burned low, they discussed royal permission. Only the crown could allow such ventures. The king's approval meant protection. It meant legitimacy. It meant opportunity. Outside those rooms, London slept. The city was smaller then. Streets were narrow. The sound of footsteps faded quickly at night. Somewhere beyond the dark river, the sea waited, calm, endless, patient. The world did not yet know that a company would soon be born, a company that would quietly step into history and slowly change the shape of nations. For now, everything remained still. The wind rested, the ships stayed at anchor, and time moved gently forward. As this first chapter closes, take a slow breath. History has begun to stir, but it has not yet spoken. The journey will continue, slowly, in the next part.
The year was 1600. England was quiet beneath a pale winter sky. Cold air drifted through narrow streets. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys, curling into the morning light. Inside candle-lit rooms, a small group of merchants waited patiently. They were not soldiers, they were not nobles, they were men of paper, ink, and careful thought. For years they had talked softly about distant lands. They had imagined ships sailing east, carrying English hopes across wide oceans. Now their moment had arrived. They sought permission, not from the sea, but from the crown. At that time, only the monarch could grant the right to trade beyond familiar waters. Without royal approval, no ship could legally claim distant markets. Queen Elizabeth I ruled England then. She was aging, but her mind remained sharp and observant. She understood power, she understood trade, and she understood patience. On the final day of December, as the year slowly came to rest, a royal document was prepared. It was written carefully, with formal language and precise meaning. This document would be known as the Royal Charter of 1600. It granted exclusive trading rights to a newly formed group, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The name was long, the meaning was simple. These merchants now had permission to trade with lands east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. The world suddenly felt larger. The charter did not promise success. It did not guarantee safety. It only opened a door. But doors can change history. The merchants accepted the charter with quiet respect. There was no celebration, no loud announcement, only calm understanding that something important had begun. They now called themselves the East India Company. With the charter secured, preparations began. Slowly. Ships were chosen with care. They needed to be strong, capable of long voyages, able to survive months at sea. Each ship was inspected, wood was checked, sails were measured, ropes were tested. Nothing was rushed. Supplies were gathered, barrels of water, salted meat, hard biscuits, and dried peas. Navigation tools were simple, maps were incomplete, stars were trusted guides. The sea remained unpredictable. Meanwhile, investors quietly placed their money. Some gave large sums, others offered modest amounts. No one knew what would return. Profit was hoped for, but loss was always possible. Outside the docks, the River Thames flowed gently. Small boats passed by. The tide came and went. London itself barely noticed what was happening. Life continued as usual. Markets opened in the morning. Church bells rang. Children played in the streets. Yet somewhere between the river and the sea, history prepared to sail. The men chosen for the voyage were ordinary sailors. They did not dream of empires. They dreamed of returning home. Many had never traveled far from England. Now they faced months of water, storms, and uncertainty. Before departure, they stood quietly on deck. Some whispered prayers, some stared at the horizon, some thought of families left behind. The ships were named carefully. Each name carried hope, strength, and tradition. On a calm morning, the sails were raised. The sound of ropes moving mixed with the call of seabirds. Slowly, the ships began to move. The East India Company had officially entered the world. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with wind and water. Behind them, England faded into mist. Ahead of them lay oceans unknown.
Back on land, the merchants returned to their ledgers. Ink scratched softly across parchment. Numbers were recorded. Expectations were measured. No one spoke of conquest. No one spoke of rule. At least, not yet. For now, the company existed only as an idea, carried by ships, protected by paper, guided by patience. As night fell, the Thames reflected candlelight. The city slept. And far out at sea, under a wide and silent sky, the first journey of the East India Company continued steadily forward. Breathe slowly. History is still calm. The waves are gentle. The next chapter will take us across the sea itself, to the long and quiet voyage east.
The ships moved slowly away from England, their sails filled with wind, not suddenly, but gently, as if the sea itself approved of their journey. Behind them, the coast faded into pale distance. Ahead of them lay open water, wide, calm, and endless. For the sailors of the East India Company, this voyage was unlike anything they had known before. Weeks turned into months. The days followed a quiet rhythm. Morning came with soft light over the waves. Sailors rose early, moving carefully across wooden decks. They adjusted ropes, checked sails, and watched the horizon. Meals were simple: salted meat, hard bread, and fresh water rationed carefully. Nothing was wasted. Everything mattered. The sea was not always the same. Some days it was smooth, like polished glass. Other days it breathed deeply, rolling in long, slow waves. At night the sky opened wide. Stars filled the darkness. The sailors lay back and stared upward, using familiar patterns to guide their way. The stars were calm companions. Occasionally, storms appeared, not suddenly, but gradually. The wind would change, clouds would gather, the sea would darken. During these moments, the sailors worked silently together. Ropes tightened, sails were adjusted. Fear existed, but it was quiet. The ships survived by patience. As they sailed south, the air grew warmer. Cold winds softened. Heavy coats were folded away. They crossed the equator slowly, entering waters few English ships had known. The days felt longer, the nights warmer. Months passed like slow breaths. Some sailors fell ill, others recovered. Life continued. No one rushed time. Eventually, land appeared again. First it was only a thin line, then hills, then coastline. The ships had reached the edges of the east. Ports appeared, busy, colorful, alive. The air carried unfamiliar scents: spices, smoke, salt, and warmth. Local boats moved calmly across the water. Merchants called out in languages the sailors did not understand. The English ships anchored quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony, only curiosity. When the company's representatives stepped on land, they moved carefully. They observed before they spoke. They listened before they acted. Trade began slowly. Cloth was exchanged. Silver changed hands. Spices were examined carefully. Nothing was forced. Indian traders were experienced. They had seen foreign merchants before. Arabs, Persians, Portuguese, all had come by sea. The English were simply new visitors. Temporary shelters were built near the shore. Goods were stored safely. Records were kept neatly. Every transaction was written down. Every agreement noted. The East India Company was learning. They learned the rhythms of the port, the rise and fall of tides,
the timing of markets. They learned that patience mattered more than speed. Days passed in calm exchange. Weeks followed. When ships were finally loaded, they prepared to return. The sails rose again. The anchors lifted. The sea welcomed them back. The return journey felt quieter. The sailors now knew the sea better. They trusted the wind. They trusted each other. Back in England, the ships arrived slowly. The ports recognized them from afar. Sails appeared on the horizon. Goods were unloaded carefully. Spices filled the air with warm scent. Silks shimmered softly. Cotton felt light and fine. The merchants gathered quietly. They examined the cargo. They checked the accounts. The voyage had been costly, but it had succeeded. Profit was not overwhelming, but it was enough. More importantly, the path was now known. The sea had been crossed. The East had been reached. No celebrations followed. No parades filled the streets. Only quiet satisfaction. The company had taken its first breath. As night settled over London, the ships rested at the docks. Water lapped gently against wood. Lanterns flickered. The city slept. And somewhere deep within ledgers and maps, the future waited, calm, patient, and slowly unfolding. Take a slow breath. The journey continues. Next, the company will begin to settle, building its first trading posts on Indian soil. When the ships returned to India once more, they did not come as strangers. The sea already knew them. The ports remembered their sails, and the wind carried them in gently. This time, the East India Company did not plan to leave quickly. Trade had shown promise, routes had been learned, trust had begun to grow. Now the company wished to stay, quietly, carefully, and without disturbance. Along the Indian coastline, life moved at its own steady pace. Fishermen rose before sunrise. Markets opened slowly. Merchants sat beneath shaded roofs, waiting patiently for customers. Nothing hurried. The company chose its locations with care. They did not seek power, they sought access. Near rivers, close to ports, and within reach of local markets, small trading posts began to appear. These were not forts, they were not cities, they were called factories, a word that meant a place of business, not industry. The first buildings were simple, wooden frames, thick walls, clay roofs. Inside, goods were stored neatly. Cotton bales rested quietly. Spices were kept dry. Silk was folded with care. English clerks worked silently at desks. Ink moved slowly across paper. Numbers were written clearly. Every transaction mattered. Outside, the world flowed calmly. Local merchants arrived daily. They brought textiles, spices, and raw materials. They spoke in measured voices. They negotiated patiently. There was no shouting, no urgency. Trade was a conversation, not a battle. The company's men learned quickly. They learned local customs. They learned gestures of respect. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Interpreters helped bridge languages. Understanding grew step by step. Tea was shared. Documents were signed. Hands were shaken slowly. Days turned into weeks. The trading posts became familiar sights. In Surat, along the western coast, the company found one of its earliest homes. Ships anchored nearby. Goods moved between land and sea. The river carried reflections of sky and sail. Further south, in Madras, another post quietly took shape. Here, the sea breeze was warm. Palm trees swayed gently. Evenings arrived softly,
with long shadows and quiet air. The company did not rule these places, they existed within them. Local authorities remained in control. Indian rulers allowed trade as long as order was respected. The East India Company understood this balance. They paid duties, they followed rules, they waited. Inside the factories, life followed a calm routine. Morning began with planning, ledgers were opened, ship schedules reviewed. Afternoons were for trade, goods were examined, quality was checked carefully. Evenings brought rest. Oil lamps were lit. The sound of water nearby softened the silence. Some clerks wrote letters home. Others read quietly. Some simply sat and listened to the night. Beyond the walls, India continued as it always had. Temples echoed with prayer, mosques filled with evening calls, villages prepared for sleep. The company watched, learned, and waited. There was no rush to expand, no hurry to control, at least not yet. Ships came and went. Each arrival brought news, each departure carried goods and letters. England felt far away, yet connected by sea and patience. Back in London, the merchants studied reports. They saw steady profits, nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, but consistency mattered. The company had planted its roots, not deeply, not forcefully, but carefully. As nights passed over the trading posts, the world grew quiet. Crickets sang softly, waves touched the shore, lantern light flickered inside small rooms. The factory slept. History, too, rested. For now. Take a slow breath. The company is still small. Its presence is still gentle. But change moves quietly. In the next chapter, life inside these factories will unfold. The people.
Inside the trading factories of the East India Company, life moved slowly and predictably. These were not busy cities. They were quiet centers of routine, built for patience rather than speed. Each morning began with soft light. The sun rose gently over rivers and sea. Shadows stretched across the courtyards. Doors opened without sound. Clerks woke early. They washed their faces. They dressed simply. There was no rush. Inside long rooms with wooden tables, ledgers waited quietly. Ink pots were filled. Quills were prepared. Pages were smoothed carefully. The day's work began. Goods were counted slowly. Bales of cotton were examined by hand. Spices were smelled, felt, and measured. Quality mattered. Every sack, every bundle was recorded in careful writing. Numbers filled the pages. Dates were noted. Names were written clearly. Outside, merchants arrived. They came alone or in small groups. Some carried samples. Some brought news. Conversations were calm. Prices were discussed patiently. Agreements were made with nods, not raised voices. Interpreters stood nearby, bridging languages with gentle care. Trust grew over time. During the hottest hours of the day, work slowed. Shaded verandas offered relief. Water was shared. Silence filled the air. The factories respected the climate. They followed the rhythm of the land. Afternoons passed quietly. Clerks updated records. Supervisors reviewed accounts. Messages were prepared for ships bound for England. Each letter was written slowly, knowing it might take months to arrive. As the sun lowered, evening approached. Oil lamps were lit. Their glow softened the rooms. The smell of warm metal and flame mixed with the scent of paper. Some workers ate simple meals together: rice, bread, stew.
Others chose solitude. They read by lamplight. They wrote in journals. They thought of home. The nights were calm. Outside the factory walls, the world continued its gentle motion. Footsteps echoed softly on stone paths. A distant call to prayer drifted through the air. Insects sang steadily. Inside, doors were closed. The factories rested. Days turned into weeks. Seasons changed slowly. Monsoon rains arrived without warning. Heavy drops struck rooftops rhythmically. Water flowed through channels and streets. Work adapted. Goods were moved to higher ground. Records were protected carefully. Patience remained. The company learned to wait. Illness came and went. Some recovered. Some returned home. New faces arrived quietly. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet, something subtle was changing. The factories became familiar landmarks. Local merchants planned around them. Ships expected their signals. The company's presence felt stable, still small, still careful, but steady. Back in England, reports arrived slowly. Merchants read them in silence. They saw efficiency. They saw order. They saw opportunity. The factories were working, not loudly, not quickly, but consistently. As years passed, the company's systems grew stronger. Routines became traditions. Processes became habits. The quiet repetition built confidence. No one spoke of dominance. No one spoke of rule. Only trade. Only order. Only time. As night settles once more, lamps dim, ledgers close, the factory sleeps. Take a slow breath. The world remains calm. But beneath the quiet routines, history is learning how to stay. In the next part, the company will begin to expand its influence, not through force, but through presence.
Years flowed like a steady river, without sudden turns or loud waves. The East India Company remained present, but not dominant, visible, but not overwhelming. Its trading posts continued their routines, ledgers filled with neat lines. Ships arrived and departed on schedule. Goods moved steadily between land and sea. Life inside the factories felt familiar now. The clerks knew their work by heart. Merchants knew when to visit. Local officials recognized the company's seals and papers. Nothing surprised anyone. Across India, empires and kingdoms still guided daily life. Local rulers governed their lands. Courts handled disputes. Markets followed ancient rhythms. The company existed within these systems, not above them. For the moment, balance remained. Seasons continued to shape everything. The monsoon arrived faithfully. Rain softened the earth. Rivers swelled gently, then slowly returned to calm. During dry months, the air grew still. Dust settled quietly on rooftops. Evenings brought cool relief. The company learned to respect these cycles. Ship schedules followed the winds. Trade followed harvests. Patience guided every decision. In London, the directors of the company met occasionally. They gathered in quiet rooms, far from the heat and dust of India. Maps lay open on tables. Reports were read slowly. Letters from distant factories were discussed carefully. The tone was measured. There was no urgency, no pressure for rapid growth. Profits were steady. Losses were manageable. This was enough. The directors believed time was their ally. The world beyond India remained restless. European powers competed quietly. The Portuguese still traded. The Dutch watched carefully. But conflict had not yet arrived. In India, the Mughal Empire still stood,
vast and organized. Its systems of governance remained strong, its influence steady. The company understood this reality. They adapted. They waited. Inside the factories, new routines developed. Younger clerks learned from older ones. Customs were passed along. Mistakes were corrected gently. Every process aimed at stability. The company valued predictability. Some English workers began to feel settled. They built simple homes nearby. They learned local words. They adjusted to the climate. India no longer felt entirely foreign. At night, the soundscape remained peaceful. Crickets sang. Water moved softly. Lantern light flickered behind small windows. The factories slept. And yet, change was approaching, not suddenly, but slowly. Small signs appeared. More ships arrived each year. Cargo volumes increased slightly. New traders requested partnerships. The company noticed. They did not rush to respond. Instead, they observed. They measured demand. They calculated risk. The idea of expansion existed, but only as a thought, a distant possibility. Back in England, new investors showed interest. The company's reputation grew quietly. It was known as reliable, orderly, patient. These qualities attracted attention. Still, the directors remained cautious. They remembered the sea. They remembered risk. Expansion could wait. For now, the company rested in calm success. The factories continued their rhythm. The ships followed familiar routes. Trade flowed without disruption. History paused in a gentle moment. The quiet before a longer movement. Take a slow breath. The night remains peaceful. But in the next chapter, the company will begin to strengthen its position through agreements, alliances, and careful steps forward.
Change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, step by step, almost unnoticed. For the East India Company, this change came through words, not weapons. Agreements replaced uncertainty. Letters replaced demands. Seals replaced force. The company continued to trade as before, but it began to listen more closely. Local rulers noticed the company's reliability. Goods arrived on time. Payments were made as promised. Trust, once formed, deepens naturally. In many regions, company representatives were invited to speak. They sat in shaded halls. They removed their shoes respectfully. They spoke carefully through interpreters. There was no rush. Topics were practical: trade routes, port access, customs duties. Small agreements were written, nothing dramatic, but each agreement added stability. Local officials appreciated consistency. Predictable trade helped markets flourish. Taxes flowed steadily. The company understood this balance. They did not ask for control. They asked for protection. Protection for goods, protection for warehouses, protection for people. In return, they offered regular trade, shared knowledge, and dependable income. Slowly, alliances formed. These were not military alliances. They were understandings. A governor would allow a factory to expand. A port official would prioritize company ships. A ruler would confirm trading rights in writing. Each decision felt small, yet together they strengthened the company's position. The factories grew slightly larger. New rooms were added. Storage improved. Walls became stronger. Not for defense, but for permanence. The company wanted to stay. Life inside the factories changed gently. More clerks arrived. Responsibilities were divided. Systems became more organized. Training improved. Records became more detailed. The work remained quiet, but it became more complex. Outside, local merchants adjusted. They learned the company's patterns. They planned shipments accordingly.
They relied on steady demand. Trade networks grew deeper. The presence of the company became normal. Children grew up seeing its flags. Ships came and went with familiar timing. The company was no longer new. It was part of the landscape. In England, directors reviewed these developments carefully. Letters described improved access, fewer delays, smoother operations. The tone of discussions changed. Expansion was no longer a distant idea. It was becoming a practical option. Still, caution remained. Every step forward was measured. Every agreement reviewed. The directors believed influence should grow naturally, like roots in soft soil. They avoided sudden moves. Across India, the political landscape remained mostly stable. The Mughal system still functioned. Local rulers maintained authority. But small shifts were beginning. Officials aged. Successions approached. Local disputes emerged quietly. The company observed these changes without interference, for now. At night, the factories remained calm. Lanterns glowed softly. Water moved gently nearby. Voices lowered with the setting sun. The company rested within its growing influence. Not powerful, not dominant, but steady. History continued its slow walk. Take a deep breath. The night remains peaceful. In the next part, we will see how trade and protection begin to blur as the company moves closer to authority.
Trade has a quiet way of shaping the world. It does not move with noise or force. It moves through habits, agreements, and trust built over time. By now, the East India Company had become a familiar presence along the Indian coast. Its ships arrived regularly, its warehouses stood quietly near rivers and ports. Its clerks moved through markets with calm confidence. The company's purpose was still trade: cotton, silk, spices, tea. But trade requires protection. Goods must be stored safely, ships must be guarded, routes must remain open. At first, protection was simple. Local guards were hired, watchmen stood at gates, locks were strengthened. These measures felt natural, necessary, unremarkable. Local rulers understood this need. They permitted small security arrangements. Order benefited everyone. But over time, the line between protection and authority began to soften. Not sharply, not suddenly, only gently. The company requested permission to station a few armed men near its factories. These men were not soldiers, they were guards. Their presence was calm. They stood quietly. They spoke little. Their purpose was reassurance. The company explained its intentions carefully. No interference, no disruption, only safety. Permissions were granted. In some places, local officials even welcomed this change. It reduced theft. It improved order near busy ports. The arrangement worked. As trade increased, so did responsibility. More goods meant more risk. More ships meant more coordination. The company began to organize protection more carefully. Records were kept, schedules established, commands clarified. Still, everything remained small in scale. At night, the guards rested, lanterns dimmed, the sound of water and wind filled the air. No one sensed danger. Inside the factories, life remained routine. Clerks counted goods. Merchants negotiated calmly. Ships came and went with the seasons. Yet subtle changes continued. The company's representatives were consulted more often. Local officials asked for opinions. Advice was given quietly. The company listened carefully. It never rushed to lead. It waited to be asked. This approach created influence. Influence grows best when it feels useful.
In England, directors received reports of these developments. They read slowly, they discussed carefully. Protection had become an essential part of trade, and trade had grown stronger. The company now faced choices. To protect trade more fully, it would need better organization, not large armies, just structure, small detachments, clear authority, defined responsibility. The directors approved cautious steps, nothing excessive, nothing dramatic. In India, these decisions took shape quietly. A few more guards, better training, clearer rules. Local rulers observed calmly. They saw no threat. The company still paid duties, still respected laws, still avoided interference. Everything felt balanced, for now. At sunset, the ports grew quiet. Sails were lowered, voices softened, markets closed gently. The company's flags moved slowly in the evening breeze. History was shifting, but only by a few inches. Take a slow breath. The night remains peaceful. In the next chapter, we will see how stability begins to falter as regional changes bring uncertainty and the company steps closer to responsibility.
The world rarely changes all at once. Instead, it shifts slowly, like sand moving beneath still water. Across India, the political landscape began to soften at the edges. The Mughal Empire, once vast and firm, remained powerful in name, but its grip was no longer as steady as before. This change did not arrive loudly. It came through quiet moments, an aging ruler, a delayed decision, a local dispute left unresolved. Life for ordinary people continued as usual. Markets opened at dawn. Rivers followed their paths. Prayers rose and faded with the day. Yet beneath the calm surface, authority became less certain. Regional governors gained more independence. Local leaders made decisions on their own. Power became uneven. The East India Company watched carefully. It did not seek chaos. Chaos disrupted trade. Instead, it observed patterns. Where authority weakened, uncertainty followed. Uncertainty slowed commerce, and slowed commerce affected everyone. Merchants hesitated. Caravans delayed journeys. Ports felt less secure. In these moments, the company was often asked to help, not to rule, not to command, but to stabilize. A warehouse needed protection. A shipment required escort. A dispute needed mediation. The company responded cautiously. It provided assistance when requested. It avoided involvement when not. Its representatives spoke softly, offering solutions rather than demands. Local officials appreciated this approach. They needed support, not competition. The company's guards became more visible, still calm, still disciplined. Their presence reassured merchants. Trade resumed more easily. Step by step, responsibility grew, not through conquest, but through necessity. In some regions, local rulers formalized arrangements. Written permissions were granted. Security duties were clarified. The company gained authority in specific areas, limited, defined, temporary, at least in intention. Inside the factories, the impact was felt quietly. More coordination was required, more communication, more planning. Clerks worked carefully. Records became more detailed. Ships adjusted routes. Timetables shifted. The company adapted. In England, directors sensed the change. Letters described instability, not danger, but unpredictability. The directors debated their response: withdraw or support stability. They chose caution. Withdrawing would risk losses. Staying required responsibility.
They approved modest expansions of protection. Again, nothing dramatic, only enough to maintain order. Across India, these measures were accepted. For many local leaders, the company's involvement brought calm. Disputes settled more quickly. Trade flowed again. Yet the balance continued to shift. The company now held not just goods, but trust. And trust carries weight. As nights fell over ports and towns, the atmosphere remained peaceful. Lanterns glowed. Waves moved softly. The sound of footsteps faded. But history was adjusting its course. The company was no longer only a trader. It was becoming a presence. Take a slow breath. The night is still quiet. In the next part, we will see how protection evolves into control, slowly, almost imperceptibly.
Authority does not always arrive with commands. Sometimes it grows quietly from responsibility. For the East India Company, this change unfolded slowly, almost without notice. What began as protection for trade started to feel like guidance. Where guards once stood only at gates, they now patrolled nearby streets, not aggressively, just present. Merchants felt safer. Ships moved with fewer delays. Goods arrived intact. The company's involvement brought calm. Local officials noticed this. In places where uncertainty had lingered, order returned gently. Disputes settled faster. Markets reopened with confidence. Trade resumed its steady rhythm. The company did not claim authority. It accepted requests. A warehouse needed oversight. A port required coordination. A road demanded protection. Each task was accepted cautiously. Each responsibility added weight. Written agreements expanded. They included not just trade rights, but duties. Who would guard the storage areas? Who would manage disputes involving company goods? Who would maintain order during busy seasons? The answers increasingly pointed toward the company, not because it demanded control, but because it was available. Inside the factories, roles evolved. Clerks now handled more than accounts. They managed logistics. They coordinated movement. Supervisors tracked not only goods, but people. Schedules became more structured, decisions more layered. The system grew quietly. In towns near the factories, people adjusted naturally. They learned company routines. They followed posted notices. They recognized authority symbols, not flags of conquest, but seals of administration. The company's presence felt official, yet still restrained. In England, the directors reviewed these changes carefully. Reports described increased responsibility, greater involvement, growing expectations. The directors understood the moment. With responsibility came risk. With authority came consequence. They did not rush forward. They moved deliberately. Policies were refined, rules clarified, lines of command defined. The company was becoming organized not only for trade, but for governance. Still, everything remained understated. No declarations, no proclamations, only process. Across India, local power structures continued to evolve. Some rulers welcomed company stability. Others remained cautious, but most recognized one truth: the company could maintain order where others struggled. This reality reshaped relationships. The company was consulted more often. Its opinions carried weight. Its decisions influenced outcomes. Slowly, authority took form. At night, the atmosphere remained calm. Lanterns glowed along docks. Guards stood quietly.
Water reflected soft light. Life continued peacefully. Yet beneath the stillness, a transformation was complete. The East India Company was no longer simply protecting trade. It was shaping space, time, and order. Take a slow breath. The night remains gentle. In the next part, we will enter a decisive moment when conflict appears and the company must respond.
Conflict rarely begins with noise. More often, it starts as tension, felt but not spoken. For the East India Company, this tension arrived gradually. Trade routes overlapped, agreements conflicted, local disputes touched company interests. None of this felt dramatic at first. Life in the ports continued. Ships still arrived. Markets still opened. But beneath the calm surface, pressure grew. European rivals had not disappeared. The Dutch traded nearby. The French established their own posts. Each company watched the others carefully. Competition remained polite, but alert. In India, local rulers faced increasing challenges. Succession disputes arose. Regional disagreements deepened. Authority became fragmented. In these moments, requests came to the company. Not demands, requests. A shipment needed escort. A warehouse needed defense. A port needed calm. The company responded carefully. Small groups of armed men were deployed. They moved quietly. They avoided confrontation. Their purpose was deterrence, not domination. Still, presence changes space. Where guards stood, people noticed. Most days passed without incident. Then one day, a disagreement escalated. A shipment was delayed. A local official objected. Voices rose briefly. The company intervened to protect its goods. There was no battle, no loud clash, only firm words, calm authority, and resolution. Yet this moment mattered. It showed that the company would act when necessary. Similar moments followed. A rival trader interfered. A dispute over customs arose. A local conflict threatened stability. Each time, the company stepped in, not aggressively, but decisively. These actions were remembered. People spoke quietly of company order, of reliability, of strength without chaos. In England, directors read reports of these events. They did not celebrate. They reflected. Conflict was expensive, but instability was worse. They authorized limited defensive measures. Nothing large, nothing loud, just enough to protect interests. Across India, these changes blended into daily life. Guards became more common, company authority more visible. Still, nights remained calm. Lanterns lit the docks. Water moved softly. The sounds of evening returned. The conflicts were quiet, almost invisible, but history took note. The company had crossed another line. It now defended not just goods, but position. Take a slow breath. The world remains gentle. In the next chapter, we will see how the company begins to rule territory, not as a plan, but as a consequence. Collect customs temporarily. Manage port schedules. Ensure safety during market days. The company accepted, carefully. These duties were meant to be short-term, but short-term solutions often last longer than expected. Once order returned, few wished to change it. The company's methods were predictable. Rules were written, processes repeated. People adjusted naturally. Soon, the company was collecting revenue to support protection, then managing disputes related to trade and land, then overseeing local administration near its factories. Each step felt logical, necessary, calm.
The company did not announce itself as a ruler, it simply continued. In places like Bengal, the shift became clearer. Revenue collection, once managed by local authorities, passed into company hands. This was not done suddenly. It followed agreements, confirmations, formal permissions. Documents were signed, seals pressed into wax. On paper, everything looked orderly. Inside the factories, new departments formed: revenue officers, legal clerks, administrators. Ledgers grew thicker, records more detailed. The company was now managing land, not just goods. With land came people: farmers, traders, workers. The company needed rules. Taxes were standardized, schedules established, procedures enforced. Most days were quiet. People paid dues, markets opened, life continued. But the nature of authority had changed. Decisions now flowed from company offices, not temples, not palaces, from desks lined with papers. In England, the directors faced a new reality. The company was no longer only a trading organization, it was governing territory. This brought profit, but also responsibility. Letters discussed ethics, costs, reputation. Some directors felt uneasy. They had not planned to rule millions. They had planned to trade. But withdrawing now would create chaos. Staying meant commitment. They chose order. Policies were drafted, officials appointed, instructions sent overseas. The company was now a ruler by circumstance. In India, the change was gradual. There were no celebrations, no declarations, only routine. Courts operated under company oversight. Taxes were collected regularly. Security remained calm. For many people, life felt stable, predictable. At night, towns rested as always. Lamps glowed softly. Water reflected moonlight. Voices faded. The ruler had changed, but the night remained peaceful. Yet, deep beneath the calm, history recorded a turning point. A company born from trade now governed land. Take a slow breath. The world remains quiet. In the next chapter, we will explore how rule brings resistance, soft at first, then clearer.
Change, even when quiet, is still change, and change is often felt before it is spoken. As the East India Company settled into its role as ruler, life across its territories continued calmly on the surface. Markets opened, fields were worked, rivers followed their ancient paths. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, small signs of discomfort appeared. They were not loud, they were not sudden, they arrived as hesitation. A farmer paused before paying tax. A merchant asked more questions than before. A local official delayed cooperation. Nothing dramatic, just subtle resistance. The company noticed. Its administrators were trained to observe patterns. They read reports carefully. They listened to local voices. They understood that rule required balance. Too much pressure would create unrest. Too little control would invite disorder. So they adjusted. Tax policies were reviewed. Some demands were softened. Schedules were altered to match harvest seasons. The company did not want rebellion. It wanted continuity. In many places, local leaders were retained. Village heads continued their roles. Community elders advised on customs. Courts followed familiar traditions. The company placed itself above these systems, not to erase them, but to supervise. This approach reduced tension. People felt heard, not always satisfied, but acknowledged. Resistance did not vanish, but it remained quiet.
Occasionally, small protests emerged. A group refused payment. A dispute turned stubborn. A rumor spread through villages. The company responded calmly. Officials were sent to listen. Negotiations followed. Compromises were offered. Force was avoided whenever possible. Stability remained the goal. In some regions, adaptation worked smoothly. Trade prospered. Revenue flowed. Order felt natural. In others, adjustment took longer. Cultural differences mattered. Local histories shaped reactions. The company learned, slowly, that ruling people was different from managing goods. In England, news of resistance arrived in measured words. Directors read reports with concern, not fear, but responsibility. They debated policy late into evenings. By candlelight, they considered the future. Profit alone was no longer enough. Reputation mattered. Legacy mattered. They instructed their officials to govern with restraint, justice over speed, consistency over force. Back in India, daily life continued. Children played in courtyards. Craftsmen worked quietly. Prayers rose at familiar hours. The presence of the company became normal, not loved, not hated, accepted. At night, towns rested as they always had. Lanterns glowed softly. Winds moved through trees. Footsteps faded into silence. Resistance remained, but subdued. Adjustment continued, patient and ongoing. History often remembers loud revolutions, but most change happens like this, slow, measured, and almost invisible. Take a slow breath. The night is still calm. In the next part, we will see how administration deepens as systems expand and the company tightens its grip through order.
Change, even when quiet, is still change, and change is often felt before it is spoken. As the East India Company settled into its role as ruler, life across its territories continued calmly on the surface. Markets opened. Fields were worked. Rivers followed their ancient paths. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, small signs of discomfort appeared. They were not loud. They were not sudden. They arrived as hesitation. A farmer paused before paying tax. A merchant asked more questions than before. A local official delayed cooperation. Nothing dramatic, just subtle resistance. The company noticed. Its administrators were trained to observe patterns. They read reports carefully. They listened to local voices. They understood that rule required balance. Too much pressure would create unrest. Too little control would invite disorder. So they adjusted. Tax policies were reviewed. Some demands were softened. Schedules were altered to match harvest seasons. The company did not want rebellion. It wanted continuity. In many places, local leaders were retained. Village heads continued their roles. Community elders advised on customs. Courts followed familiar traditions. The company placed itself above these systems, not to erase them, but to supervise. This approach reduced tension. People felt heard, not always satisfied, but acknowledged. Resistance did not vanish, but it remained quiet. Occasionally, small protests emerged. A group refused payment. A dispute turned stubborn. A rumor spread through villages. The company responded calmly. Officials were sent to listen. Negotiations followed. Compromises were offered. Force was avoided whenever possible. Stability remained the goal. In some regions, adaptation worked smoothly. Trade prospered. Revenue flowed. Order felt natural. In others, adjustment took longer. Cultural differences mattered. Local histories shaped reactions. The company learned, slowly, that ruling people was different from managing goods. In England, news of resistance arrived in measured words. Directors read reports with concern,
Not fear, but responsibility. They debated policy late into evenings. By candlelight, they considered the future. Profit alone was no longer enough. Reputation mattered. Legacy mattered. They instructed their officials to govern with restraint, justice over speed, consistency over force. Back in India, daily life continued. Children played in courtyards, craftsmen worked quietly, prayers rose at familiar hours. The presence of the company became normal, not loved, not hated, accepted. At night, towns rested as they always had. Lanterns glowed softly. Winds moved through trees. Footsteps faded into silence. Resistance remained, but subdued. Adjustment continued, patient and ongoing. History often remembers loud revolutions, but most change happens like this, slow, measured, and almost invisible. Take a slow breath. The night is still calm. In the next part, we will see how administration deepens as systems expand and the company tightens its grip through order.
Ruling a land requires more than authority. It requires structure. As the East India Company settled deeper into governance, its attention turned towards systems, quiet, detailed, and consistent. Administration became the foundation of control. Offices expanded, new departments formed, records multiplied. Everything was written down. Land boundaries were measured, tax assessments recorded, population counts attempted. The company believed order came from clarity. Clerks worked long, silent hours. Their quills moved steadily across paper. Ledgers filled shelves. Numbers replaced memory. Rules replaced tradition, slowly and carefully. Courts were organized. Disputes over land, trade, and taxes were brought before company-appointed officials. Local laws were often respected, but final authority rested elsewhere. Judgments were written, punishments standardized, consistency was valued. Across towns and villages, notices appeared. They announced tax dates, trade regulations, market rules. Many people could not read them, but they understood their meaning. Order had a new shape. The company relied heavily on local intermediaries, collectors, clerks, messengers. These men bridged worlds. They spoke local languages. They understood customs. They carried company instructions. This system worked, but imperfectly. Some intermediaries abused their position. Others resisted quietly. The company responded with audits. Records were checked, reports compared, irregularities noted. Discipline followed, not harshly, but firmly. Administration deepened. Roads were mapped, ports regulated, warehouses standardized. Trade moved more efficiently. Revenue increased steadily. With revenue came confidence. The company felt secure. But security brought distance. Decisions were made in offices far from fields and villages. Policies were logical on paper, but uneven in reality. Some regions prospered, others struggled. The company noticed the imbalance. Adjustments were attempted. Rates changed, deadlines shifted, exemptions granted. Still, control tightened. The system demanded compliance. In England, directors reviewed growing stacks of reports. The scale surprised them. What had begun as trade had become governance on a vast level. Some felt pride, others unease. The company now ruled millions, yet it remained, on paper, a corporation. This contradiction lingered. In India, people adapted. They learned procedures. They followed schedules. They worked within the system. Life continued. At night, administrative centers grew quiet. Offices closed. Lamps dimmed. Guards rested. Beyond the walls, villages slept as they always had.
Crickets sang, wind moved through leaves, rivers flowed unchanged. Order held, but control, once tightened, rarely loosens easily. Take a slow breath. The night remains gentle. In the next chapter, we will see how reform attempts arise as both criticism and conscience begin to shape company rule.
Power, once established, begins to reflect itself. As the East India Company ruled more territory, voices began to rise, not in anger, but in concern. Some came from India, some came from England. They spoke of fairness, of responsibility, of limits. In India, local leaders quietly observed company administration. They noticed the efficiency, but they also noticed strain. Taxes were steady, but heavy. Rules were clear, but rigid. Traditions were respected, but increasingly sidelined. These concerns were shared cautiously. Letters were written, petitions submitted, conversations held behind closed doors. The company listened, slowly. In England, criticism grew more visible. Parliament took interest. Reports arrived describing the company's power, its wealth, its control over land and people. Some members were impressed. Others were uneasy. They asked difficult questions. Should a trading company rule territories? Who should oversee its decisions? Where did accountability lie? These questions did not demand immediate answers, but they lingered. Public discussions followed. Pamphlets circulated. Newspapers debated. The company's image began to change, no longer just merchants, but governors. The directors felt the pressure. They feared damage to reputation. They feared loss of trust. Reform became a topic of serious discussion. Committees were formed, policies reviewed. The company issued new instructions. Officials were told to govern justly, to avoid exploitation, to consider local welfare. Training improved. New administrators were educated in law, language, and ethics. The company wanted to appear responsible. In India, some changes were felt. Certain taxes were reduced, abusive officials removed. Courts reviewed decisions more carefully. These actions calmed tensions, but reform was uneven. Distance slowed change. What was decided in London took months to reach Indian shores, and interpretation varied. Some officials embraced reform, others resisted. They believed strict control was necessary for order. This difference in approach created inconsistency. Still, the idea of conscience had entered governance. The company was no longer blind to its influence. It was aware. At night, both in England and India, lamps burned late. People read reports, wrote letters, reflected. History was being shaped not by battles, but by debate. The company stood at a crossroads. Continue as before, efficient but distant, or adapt, careful, measured, human. The answer would unfold slowly. Take a slow breath. The night remains calm. In the next part, we will explore how reform meets resistance and how control tightens once more in response to fear.
Reform brings hope, but it also brings fear. For the East India Company, the promise of change created uncertainty. Some officials welcomed reform, others worried it would weaken authority. They feared loss of control. They feared disorder. They feared challenge. Fear rarely speaks loudly. It tightens quietly. In several regions, company administrators responded to uncertainty by strengthening control.
Rules were enforced more strictly. Procedures followed without flexibility. Punishments applied evenly but firmly. Order became priority once again. Local voices were still heard, but less influence followed. Requests took longer to approve. Exceptions became rare. This shift was subtle, yet noticeable. People sensed the change. Markets felt more regulated, courts more formal, officials more distant. The company believed firmness would prevent unrest. Stability, in their view, required clear authority. In England, news of local tensions arrived slowly. Reports described calm surfaces, but careful language hinted at unease. Parliament debated further oversight. Some members pushed for stronger regulation of the company. Others warned against interfering with profit. The company stood between two pressures: control in India, scrutiny in England. This balance was difficult. To protect its position, the company centralized power. Decisions were pulled upward, local discretion reduced, standard rules applied across regions. Uniformity replaced flexibility. This brought efficiency, but also distance. Local customs, once consulted, were now secondary. The company did not intend cruelty, it intended order. Yet order without understanding creates silence. Silence hides tension. Small incidents increased, disputes delayed, complaints unanswered, trust weakened. Still, daily life continued. People adapted, as people always do. At night, towns remained quiet. Lanterns lit familiar streets. Guards stood watch. The sound of steps faded. But beneath the calm, pressure gathered. History often waits patiently. It allows systems to tighten until they cannot breathe. The company had not reached that point yet, but the air was changing. Take a slow breath. The night remains gentle. In the next chapter, we will see how fear turns into resistance, not sudden, but organized.
Silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means waiting. Across the lands governed by the East India Company, life continued in its familiar rhythm. Fields were cultivated, markets opened each morning, rivers carried boats as they always had. But conversations changed. They became quieter, more careful. People spoke in private spaces, inside homes, beneath trees, after sunset. The unrest did not appear as anger. It appeared as memory. People remembered earlier days, different rules, local authority. They compared the past to the present. Taxes felt heavier, procedures felt colder, officials felt distant. These feelings moved slowly from one village to another. There was no leader yet, no single voice, only shared experience. The company noticed small signs. Reports mentioned delays. Officials described reluctance. Collectors noted hesitation. Nothing severe, but patterns matter. In response, the company observed carefully. They believed unrest could be managed through visibility, more inspections, more patrols, more reminders of authority. This presence was meant to reassure. Instead, it reminded people of distance. Still, no open conflict appeared. People adapted again. They followed rules, they paid taxes, they remained quiet. But quiet does not erase feeling. In some regions, religious leaders expressed concern. They spoke of tradition, of respect, of balance. Their words were gentle but influential. The company listened cautiously. Religion was sensitive, culture complex. They avoided interference where possible.
Elsewhere, local elites felt displaced, their influence reduced, their roles limited. They felt overlooked. This created subtle alliances, shared interests, shared concerns, nothing formal yet. In England, the company's directors received mixed reports. Profits remained strong, order appeared intact, but letters hinted at strain. The company debated its approach, maintain control or allow flexibility. Fear of loss often outweighs trust. They chose caution. Back in India, the night remained calm. Lanterns flickered, dogs barked distantly, footsteps echoed briefly, then faded. People lay down to sleep with thoughts unspoken. History does not always move loudly. Sometimes it waits for alignment. The company still ruled, but beneath the silence, unrest had begun to grow, patient, collective, inevitable. Take a slow breath. The night remains quiet. In the next chapter, we will see how this unrest begins to take form through organization, symbols, and shared purpose.
Unrest, when shared long enough, begins to take shape. It no longer lives only in feeling, it begins to organize. Across the lands governed by the East India Company, small connections formed quietly, not in open meetings, not in public squares, in homes, in places of worship, along riverbanks at dusk. People spoke softly, they listened carefully, they shared stories of taxes, of rules, of lost authority. These stories sounded similar from place to place. Recognition created unity. The first signs of organization were subtle. Messages passed by word of mouth. Trusted messengers carried news. Travelers spread ideas. No written plans, no declarations, just understanding. Symbols began to appear. Old customs were emphasized. Traditional gatherings became more frequent. Cultural practices gained new meaning. What once was routine now felt intentional. The company noticed changes. Officials reported increased gatherings. Collectors mentioned delayed payments. Magistrates observed growing confidence among locals. Still, nothing violent occurred. The resistance was careful. It avoided confrontation. It avoided attention. It focused on patience. In some regions, local leaders quietly coordinated. Village heads communicated across boundaries. Religious figures shared messages of unity. Merchants discussed shared concerns. These connections strengthened resolve. The company responded with observation. Spies were unnecessary. Everything was happening in plain sight, just quietly. Administrators debated response, suppress early or allow expression. They feared that force might create exactly what they wished to avoid. So they waited. They increased documentation. They sent detailed reports to England. They asked for guidance. In England, the mood was cautious. Parliament continued discussions. Public opinion shifted slowly. Some warned of danger. Others dismissed concerns. The company chose restraint for now. Meanwhile, people continued organizing, not as rebels, not as armies, as communities. They learned to move together, to agree silently, to pause collectively. Resistance does not always shout. Sometimes it breathes. At night, towns rested as always, but conversations lingered longer. Lights stayed on later. Thoughts traveled further. History was preparing itself, not for chaos, but for change. The company still held power, but power, when watched closely, begins to feel heavy. Take a slow breath. The night remains calm.
In the next chapter, we will see how organized resistance meets reaction and how patience is tested. Not every confrontation arrives with weapons. Some arrive with refusal. Across company-ruled lands, organized resistance reached a quiet turning point. People did not rise suddenly. They did not shout. They paused. Taxes were delayed together. Markets closed early together. Work slowed, not individually, but collectively. This unity surprised company officials. There were no leaders to arrest, no declarations to suppress, no battles to fight, only absence. Collectors returned with lighter records. Officials reported hesitation. Courts saw fewer participants. Everything still existed, just less cooperative. The company called this troubling. It challenged authority without breaking laws openly. Administrators responded with dialogue. Meetings were arranged. Local leaders were invited to speak. Concerns were heard. These conversations were calm. Voices were respectful. Requests were measured. People asked for fairness, for flexibility, for recognition of tradition. The company listened, but listening did not always mean agreement. Some officials believed compromise would weaken rule. Others saw negotiation as strength. This division slowed decisions. Meanwhile, resistance remained steady, not growing louder, just more confident. The company avoided force. They remembered earlier unrest elsewhere. They feared escalation. Instead, they relied on pressure, reminders of obligation, warnings of consequence, legal notices. These were delivered politely but firmly. People received them quietly. Compliance returned in some places. In others, delay continued. The confrontation remained unresolved. No battlefields formed, no blood was shed, yet authority felt challenged. In England, reports described the situation carefully, not rebellion, but defiance. Parliamentarians debated again. Some argued for reform, others for strength. The company felt the weight of both. In India, life continued its rhythm. Children played, crops grew, evenings remained calm. But trust had shifted. People had learned they could act together. The company had learned control was not absolute. This mutual realization changed everything. History often remembers war, but sometimes the most important confrontations happen without noise. Take a slow breath. The night remains peaceful. In the final chapter, we will see how this long story settles, not with an ending, but with transformation.